So there's a handout that goes with this class as well, and what we're going to do is do one-page summaries or overviews of each book as we go through, and we're starting with Genesis today, and that will be kind of the format that we're going to be following, but this has proven to be extremely helpful to have the bird's eye view of the book. And most of these notes, of course, will be coming from the textual structure of the book itself. But for a way of introduction, the word Genesis is actually from the Greek word, which means the genealogy or the beginning. You hear the word genealogy in the word Genesis, and that's where it comes from. It has to do with the very beginning of things or the origin of things. And so the word Genesis is from the Greek title of the book. The Hebrew title of the book is Bereshit, and that is the first word of the book. And that's just the way the Hebrew titles were on their scrolls. It was just the first words of the book. So the Hebrew title was just called In the Beginning. In Exodus, the Hebrew title was These the Names. And the book of Leviticus, anyway, I could go on from there. So it's just, they're unhelpful. That's why we've adopted in our English translations titles either from the Latin or from the Greek Bibles. And Genesis is from the Greek Bible, and it means the origin, the genealogy, the beginnings. And of course, if we had to sum up what it talks about, the beginning of what? The beginning of what? And so, as you can see on your outline, obviously the heavens and the earth. This is the first verse of the whole book. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And when we think of heavens and the earth today, oftentimes we think of it in scientific terms, like we step back and we see maybe the solar system. And we see the sun, and we have the planets around it, and we have the stars. And maybe we think of something like that. Now, that certainly would be entailed because we know that that's what God created, right? He created the heavens and the earth, or the space as well as the matter that's in space, which would be the idea. But I think it's better for us to think of it in terms of seeing a picture, perhaps, of a field, maybe. Some people on the field, some animals over here, some trees, and then you have sky with some clouds, and you have the sun above. That's the picture of saying God created the heavens and the earth. That is, the heavens be the sky, the expanse and all that's in them. That would include those little dots in the sky at night. That would include the big burning ball of fire in the sky during the day. That's the heavens. And then the earth would be everything we stand on, everything that where we live, where we do our work, and where most of our vision centers is here on the earth. That can be an important distinction to make when you get into some details of the discussion about the heavens and the earth and all that the Bible says about that. But that's what Genesis is starting off with. It's saying everything in our purview, everything that we see around us, and when we look up and when we look down, God created that. He's the source. He's the creator. The vegetation and the animals would be then delineated as you go through the rest of the chapter. And then it apexes in man and woman. And then the marriage and the family that is then described as well as designed right there. For this cause a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they two shall become one flesh. So that's the whole design idea. It's for this reason, because God created things to be designed this way, that we reach the home and the family, and based upon a marriage, a covenant between a man and a woman. So that's the idea. Of course, we're still in just the first few chapters of Genesis. But then it begins to talk about entrance of the problem, sin and death. So remember, not just the beginning of the world, the beginning of sin and death is included in the Genesis account. It's where it all started, when the woman took of the tree and gave to her husband with her, and he did eat. And then, of course, the beginning of salvation history. We find this as early as chapter 3, don't we? I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between her seed and your seed. And so God has already started a plan to redeem sinful man. Salvation history. And of course, this history is told by the one who was actually there. We trust in what God says about it. There was no human there before Adam was created. And there was no human there to witness the first chapter. We simply rely on the fact that God inspired these words and these chapters to be written. It was written originally by Moses. At least that's the way it's credited in the New Testament. I have some verses there, but you remember Jesus said that this is what I spoke while I was still with you, that everything written in the law of Moses and the Psalms and the prophets. So that's a threefold division of the Old Testament scriptures as we have them. The law of Moses is all of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's the first 5 books of the Old Testament is attributed to Moses. So he's going to be the authority behind it, and he's, of course, the lawgiver of the Old Testament who had face-to-face conversations and contact with God himself. And so it's written by Moses, and it was written during the wilderness period of 40 years. Now, I guess I should say at least compiled, if not written some before that, but at least he's the one who completed the law in his lifetime, and that's how we have it today, is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The key word in all of the book, there's 50 chapters, right? The key word is this word, genealogy. My translation has the word history written, and it's used 10 times in the book. So this is not just an imposed outline, it's what's in the text itself. If you look at Genesis chapter 2 and verse 3, chapter 2 and verse 4 actually. Somebody read that.
This is the account of the heavens and the earth when they were created in the day that the Lord God made them earthly.
So here's a statement that begins the first genealogy. Seth's translation said the account. It's the Genesis, the genealogy, the history, the account. That's the word that we're talking about. That's the key word because it divides the book into 10 sections. And it's used 10 times, okay? It shows in the text itself. So the first time it's used, the one that Seth just read, this is the history of the heavens and the earth. Now, it's what follows that is what he's talking about. So now we can get started. This is the history of the heavens and the earth in the day that the Lord God created them. Before any plant of the field was in the earth, but a mist went up, verse 7 and verse 8. The Lord formed man of the dust of the ground. So that's the history of the heavens and the earth that he's talking about. So what about chapter 1? It serves more as it's like, okay, the king is walking down the red carpet and is about to take place on his throne, set on the throne. And so, hear ye, everybody stand up. And it marches through this creation week. And it's the introduction. It's the introduction to everything in Genesis, those 10 genealogies that follow. And it's just God marching through the creation week, and his sovereignty and his speech is obeyed. Right? And God said, and it was so. And God saw, hey, things are well when they go as I say. Everything was good, right? And then at the time it's over in Genesis chapter 1, verse 31, then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. That's the first time the idea of very good is used. And the evening and the morning were the 6th day. And then the conclusion is verses 1 through 3 of chapter 2. The 7th day, God rested. In other words, he stopped, is what it means by rested. We shouldn't think of God sitting down and having to wipe the sweat off of his brow and have a glass of tea. He's not tired. He just stopped. In other words, there's no more material creation going on. It's done. It's been done since day 7. Okay? And so that is the idea there. Then begins the first history or genealogy or account or whatever, however different translations say. And it's chapter 2, verse 4 that begins talking about the home and the family, because this is what it's all about. And about the roles of the husband and wife, and about their place in making the garden where they are planted, where they are put, to flourish. The whole point of the material creation is that Adam and Eve were supposed to rule over it and tend it and keep it so that God could make it flourish and grow and cover the whole world, cover the whole creation with a paradise. That's the whole point of putting man there, so that he could do that in God's honor, so that God could bless everything that comes under it. And so that's what this very first genealogy, or this first history of the heavens and the earth, is all about. Okay? Now we know, of course, how it went, because the rest of the genealogy tells. The serpent was cunning. He deceived. He misled them, and he got them to focus on other things. And, of course, using their free will, they decided to do things their own way. And then everything went downhill, right? That's where sin and death entered the world. But God began his own plan. And this is all within this first genealogy, because the second genealogy is in chapter 5, verse 1. So you go through the first sin, you go through the first, the banishment from the garden, you go through the first murder, the first death, right? I mean, Adam and Eve didn't die yet, but Abel did, right? So sin has now entered. Chapter 4, death has now become a reality. Chapter 5, verse 1. This is the book of the genealogy of Adam. So my translation differs, but it's the same Hebrew word that we read in 2 verse 4. Okay? Because this is how Moses divides the book into 10 Genesises. Try to say that 10 times fast. Genesises. There's 10 of them in here, and this is the second one, chapter 5, verse 1. And this is the Genesis, the book of the Genesis of Adam, that is the beginning, and then how Adam continued, and it was through his offspring. And so then you have that goes all the way through chapter 6 and verse 8, where that same Genesis that just recorded in chapter 5 ends up about the same as the one in chapters 2 and 3 and 4, right? Because it ends up where sin is just everywhere. And the last verse is chapter 6, verse 8, that says, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." This is hearkening back to, I'm going to send the seed of the woman to ultimately take care of the problem. But sin has gone rampant again, but I'm going to use Noah to continue this promise. You with me? The third Genesis of the book is chapter 6, verse 9. This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations and such. Noah walked with God. And then it talks about how God preserved humanity through the days of Noah and that flood that he sent to destroy his creation. Yes, that's the idea. That's the lesson of the flood, is God is destroying what he created, because sin has tainted it. Sin has destroyed it, basically. And so God's coming in judgment to destroy it. But, of course, there's still this note of grace, all based on that first promise in Genesis 3:15, that God will send the seed of woman. There's going to be, through humanity, an answer to this problem, but it's a hard time coming, right? And so by the end of the flood story, you have the promise of the rainbow in chapter 9. If you remember, God says, all right, I'm not going to destroy my creation again with a flood. Instead, I'm going to use Noah's offspring, and until this is all taken care of, seed time and harvest, winter and summer and all that, they're not going to cease. So thankfully, we don't have to worry about a worldwide flood. There's been a lot of local floods since then, but not any worldwide floods. And we don't hear about this idea of God destroying his creation until the New Testament, when Peter borrows the language from Isaiah, which borrows the language from Genesis 1:1, about a new creation, right? A new heavens and a new earth. Well, he gets that language from Genesis 1:1. God created the heavens and the earth. Well, he destroyed them in a typological fashion in Noah's day, but he will destroy them in a flood of fire in the end, right? And then there will come the new heavens and the new earth. But that's the same thing, a new environment, a new creation, so that man can now live in what God always intended them to live in, a paradise, I guess you would call it. We call it heaven. But the point is that the first Adam failed and didn't do it, but the second Adam succeeded. And what he is going to bring is what Adam should have brought to begin with, but it just didn't happen that way because of sin. That's 6:9. It goes to 10:1. This is the next one. This is the genealogy of the sons of Noah. So there's that same phrase. This is the genealogy. So now we get from the flood to, in chapter 10, verse 1, there's a special section here about the nations that came from Noah and his 3 sons. But the fifth genealogy is chapter 11, verse 10. This is the genealogy of Shem. So what you have now is a genealogy to get you from Noah to Abraham, who is going to be the next major player in this plan to reverse the problems brought in by the first sin, right? And so that gets us through the first 11 chapters of Genesis. You'll notice that in a lot of our teaching, we make a point that the first 11 chapters of Genesis is a unique section. And that the rest of Genesis is its own section. Why would we do that? The dividing line is obviously Abraham, right? But do you see there's different subject matter? In the first 11 chapters, it's about universal creation. It's about things that we can call today global. They wouldn't have thought global back then. But we know of it now today as global history. The creation of everything, and then the sin entering in and just, messing everything up, God destroying everything in a flood, and then working through Noah and his descendants, the origin of all the nations in the world globally, right? So all of this is global. But now when you get to chapter 12, what do? God narrows down to just one man that is going to end up being what? One nation. Out of all of the nations in the world, there'll be one nation. So Abraham is the beginning of all that. In fact, here's the way that is best to look at it, or I think most accurate. The whole rest of the Old Testament, if not to say the whole Bible, is about this. It's about God choosing Abraham out of the world and saying, I'm going to use you to fulfill my promise that I made in Genesis 3. And so you uniquely are going to be the one that is going to be the fulfillment of all of these. Well, how does the New Testament apply that? The seed of Abraham is Christ. Galatians 3:16. And then later in the chapter he says, and if you are Christ, you are Abraham's offspring. You're Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. The promise, the one promise. And it's this one. So this is really just almost as significant as the creation of the heavens and the earth in Genesis 1:1. Because this is the only hope of it all. That God is going to work through this man. And so that's why Abraham has such a central place, almost as central, if not more so in many respects, as Moses himself. Right? Only Jesus could be more important than this because he's the one who's going to do the heavy lifting. He's going to be the one that actually does what nobody could ever do. So that's why I have that divided there in on number 3 on your outline, that there's a universal history and then a national history. National meaning Israel history through Abraham. But you can see that the way it's divided as far as that literary feature I'm talking about, this is the genealogy, there's still 5 and 5. See it? 5 of those phrases in the first 11 chapters, and then 5 of those phrases in the last, how many would that be? 39? So I'm just saying these are significant things to keep in mind so that when you think of the book of Genesis, boom, you got all that. You kind of see the point and the structure. It's like that. And now when you go to study any individual text, you're already there. You already know the immediate and a little bit more remote context. And that'll prevent you from over-extrapolating or under-extrapolating or falsely applying these kinds of texts. And it's important to see that. And so we won't go through each of those specific phrases. In fact, chapter 11 could have ended and probably should have ended in chapter 11, verse 26. That should have been the last verse, if we wanted to divide the English Bible into chapters that are more appropriate for what we're doing. Because this is how Moses divided it. And he starts now with the genealogy of Terah. You notice it doesn't say the genealogy of Abraham. It says the genealogy of Terah because that's the way Moses wrote it, not the way we would have written it, or at least we don't think we would right away until we see the point. The point, of course, is that you had Noah ending the genealogy in chapter 5. Noah had 3 sons. And one of those sons was used in a unique way to bring about the promise, and that would be through Shem. Well, genealogy in chapter 11 ends with Terah, and he had 3 sons. And one of those sons are going to be used by God in a unique way to fulfill the promises, and that's going to be Abraham. Are you with me? So there is structure. There is absolute purposeful structure in the way that it's written that we can miss that we may not recognize if it's not pointed out. What did the Ethiopian eunuch say? How can I except someone guide me? But when somebody does bring these things out, now it should be, it's locked in. It's in my lockbox. So the genealogies have the same number of names, ending with a man with 3 sons in chapter 5 and chapter 11. And it doesn't end with Abraham, it ends with Terah. And then his 3 sons, Haran, Nahor, and Abram. So that's how that works. But anyway, the one son that he chooses is Abram. And by the way, Abram wasn't the oldest. He's mentioned first in verse 27 and 26 and 27 because he's probably the most important, but he's not the firstborn. He had an older brother. But anyway, let's move on to our application here. So anyway, as long as you're with me on what we're saying about the structure, this is an overview. This is a bird's eye view. You back up from Genesis and you see it on a line, maybe 50 chapters. Oh, okay, the first 11. Well, that's pretty significant. That's just as significant as all of these others. But now I know why. And I see how we got there. And I see that God is actually working out a plan in his sovereignty. The sovereign God who marched through chapter 1 saying, let there be, and let there be, and let there be. Oh, and that's good, and this is good, and this is going to work, and this is what I'm starting by my own sovereignty, is also the one when you step back who's going, okay, I'm going to work through this man, I'm going to call this man, I'm going to do this man, because I know what this man would do if I called him in these situations. That's sovereignty. That's foreknowledge or middle knowledge working with sovereignty to accomplish human history down to the meticulous detail that, of course, only God can do. And that's what Genesis is about. That's what, I kind of skipped over something. Let me get into number 5, and we'll back up to number 4 in a second. Look at number 5 on your outline. This is what I was saying all along because I got off on my organizing my thoughts here. But number 5 says interesting lessons. Number 1 is God's election. See, you think, wait, Genesis teaches God's election? I don't remember reading the word election. But the whole point is that at every turn, God is choosing someone. And that's what election is. He's choosing someone. Now, the New Testament uses the word election and applies it to this kind of thing. And that God has the sovereignty to choose who he wants to choose. Right? He can choose you, but he doesn't have to choose me. It's up to him. Now, the problem is with theologies today, like Calvinism, they apply that to individual particular salvation and say, oh, the Bible must teach that God chooses you for salvation, but not the man next to you because he just doesn't want to save that person. But see, that's not what the Bible teaches about God's freedom to choose. Now, God could, I suppose, if he wanted to, do it that way, but the Bible doesn't say he does it that way. The Bible says he wants to save everybody, and so he has chosen these individuals throughout history to work out the plan to bring Jesus into the world to make that salvation available to everybody. That's the way the Bible talks about election. So God does not elect every single individual in this plan to do that. In fact, he didn't choose Terah or Nahor. He chose Abram. He said, that's the one I'm electing. But he's not electing him to be saved for eternity and not the other two. He's electing him to be a part of this plan that human history is going to be guided for the rest of time to the salvation, to offer salvation to everybody. It's a pretty amazing thing, isn't it? I am talking actually about Romans 9, verses 6 through 13. Do you see it on your outline? Now, as you're turning to Romans 9, 6 through 13, let me read what this says on the outline. It says, God rarely chooses the firstborn to prove that he has sovereign election. That's what I mean there. In other words, God chooses ways that are often different than our own ways of doing things. What was man's way of doing things? Oh, I'm going to give my firstborn a double portion. My firstborn's going to get special treatment. He's going to inherit the house, and then his brothers are going to be able to live with him, but he's going to be the next patriarch. He's going to be the next one that's in charge, and he's going to get twice the inheritance and a double portion and the birthright, the blessing. In other words, he's going to take over the house. So that's just the way patriarchy works. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. I'm just saying that's the way we've done. But God seems to go out of his way in the book of Genesis to say, I think I'll choose the secondborn in all these men. Isn't that something? And so the New Testament capitalizes on it. For instance, Romans 9 is actually making that very point in explicit terms. And it's so unfortunate that it's been used for so long by Reformation preachers, by Reformed theologians to teach Calvinism, that we're almost unable to see what's really being said there. Because Calvinism wants to go to this passage and say, see, God chooses individually for salvation who he wants, and he passes over those who he don't want, that he doesn't want. But this has nothing to do with individual salvation. This has everything to do with what we're talking about back in Genesis, that God is choosing individuals to work out history because he knows what they would freely do. And he says, I'm going to work with that to bring about Christ. So it's not like choosing Abraham and Isaac and Jacob for individual salvation and not their brothers. It's choosing them to work out this plan. Here's how he puts it. Verse 6 says, it's not that the word of God has taken no effect. We won't get into the meaning of that verse. That phrase, it takes us too far afield. But here's where we'll start. They are not all Israel who are of Israel. What does he mean? So you look back at Old Testament Israel and you have a nationality. Well, they're all family, right? They've all descended from one another. I mean, they trace their family tree back to Abram ultimately. So that you would say, well, that's Israel. Paul is making a point here in Romans 9 through 11 and saying, yeah, that's Israel in one sense. That's Israel genealogically or genetically. But God has a true Israel. God has a real Israel or a spiritual Israel that he is going to save eternally. And that's why he says not all who are of Israel are Israel. In other words, not all of those who are genealogically from Abraham are going to be saved. God chose Abraham for a specific purpose. And so now he's going to get into some details about that. He says in verse 7, not even all those are children because they are the seed of Abraham. Instead, it was in Isaac your seed shall be called. Okay? So they're not even all children of God because they're of Abraham. Instead, in Isaac is the way God chose in his sovereign choice to work this plan. If Israel thinks that they are somehow special to God because they can trace their genealogy back to Abraham, there are lots of other nations that can do that too. How many nations came out of Abraham? 12 others besides Israel. Isn't that something? And so that alone is proof that Israel's inconsistent in saying we are God's people because we descended from Abraham. Well, you realize there's other nations in the world that descended from Abraham too, and you claim that they're apostates or they're scum. Why? Well, why is Israel special to God in the Old Testament? Because he chose Isaac. Okay? In Isaac your seed shall be called. By the way, Isaac wasn't the firstborn son of Abraham. Was he? Ishmael was. and he passed over Ishmael, and he went with the second-born. Now, what about Isaac's son? Having to skip over a few here. Verse 10 says, not only this, but when Rebekah also had conceived by one man, even by our father Isaac, because the children were not yet born, and they hadn't done good or evil, so that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him who calls, it was said to her, the older shall serve the younger. So which one is going to get preferential choosing? The younger one. The older one's actually going to serve the younger one, because God's going to elevate this younger one to a special role. And we know what that is, right? Who were the two sons? Jacob and Esau. And Esau was the firstborn. But Jacob received the election from God to say, I'm going to use you to make the nation that I've intended to make the whole time. Are you with me? I know we're getting into some spade work here, but that's what's going on. This is what Genesis has revealed to us that Paul is capitalizing on. And he's saying, here's an interesting lesson from the book of Genesis about God's election. It's that God doesn't do things according to the way we expect him to do things. Especially in this. He rarely chooses the firstborn, but he does it because he wants to show he has the sovereignty to choose who he wants to choose. And so what he's chosen is Abraham out of 3 brothers. He's chosen Isaac out of 2 brothers, and he was the secondborn. He's chosen Jacob out of 2 brothers, and he was the secondborn. And it's not based upon them being good or bad people. It's based upon the fact that God has the right to choose who he wants. Now we know from other passages, God chooses according to what he middle knows. The word is just foreknows in the Bible. Middle knows is more technical because worked out philosophically, that's the way we would call it. But here's what Peter says. 2 Peter chapter 1. Come on. It's 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 2. Somebody read that? It might be in chapters 1 and 2, verses 1 and 2. Somebody read 1 Peter 1, 1 and 2.
Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who reside as aliens scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who are chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, by the sanctifying work of the Spirit, to obey Jesus Christ, and be sprinkled with his blood. His grace and peace be yours.
Yeah. So you see at the beginning of verse 2, you are chosen by God according to what? Foreknowledge. And again, I'm saying if you got into the mechanics of, not the mechanics, but the framework of how his foreknowledge works in his election, you can delineate it by saying middle knowledge, meaning he knew what Jacob and Esau both would do if they were called to do, to say, okay, I need you to go to Bethel, or I need you to go over here, I want you to do this, I want you to do that. He knew what they would do, and he says, I'm going to use this one because I know what he would do, and this is going to help fulfill my plan. He's going to be a part of it. So election is according to God's foreknowledge of our future free acts, right? So that's what's going on in the book of Genesis. God could have said, all right, let's try Terah. But in his foreknowledge, he knows, whenever I say Terah, I need you to leave Ur of the Chaldees, and I need you to go to Haran, and then I need you to go to a land that I'll tell you about later. Terah would go, I don't know, that's quite a leap of faith there. I think I'm going to stick around. Well, I'm not going to call him because he's not going to obey me. Let's see, Abraham's going to do that. Abraham will obey me. And so I will call him, and here's a man out of all the nations that I know, he's going to have a son who will do the same thing, and then he's going to have a grandson who's going to do the same thing, and then they're going to be a line of faith, or at least faith will be a line through their genealogy, and I'm going to work my plan to bring in the Savior, who will crush the head of Satan through this line right here. And that's what he's doing. It's an amazing thing. And I've often pointed to how Paul concludes this whole section of Romans. Romans 9, 10, and 11 is one section. You've got to read it all together. It should just be one huge chapter, actually. But look at Romans 11, verse 33 and following. Somebody read 33 through 36. And here's how Paul concludes this whole thought.
33 through 36.
Please.
Oh, the depth of the riches, both of the wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and unfathomable his ways. For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who became his counselor? Or who has first given to him that it might be paid back to him again? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever and forever.
Yeah, so anytime a Bible teacher tries to teach this section of Scripture, if there's not some semblance of that feeling at the end of it, he hadn't done a very good job. Because that's what it evokes in anybody who begins to grasp what Paul is saying about God in chapters 9, 10, and 11 of Romans, based on Genesis for the most part, based on other passages too, but it starts out in Genesis, in saying the sovereign God knows, he says, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge. God uses his knowledge, his omniscience, in the wisest way possible to work out a plan through free creatures to bring about the Christ. And now of him, to him, and through him are all things, and to him will be glory forever and ever. It's quite a deal. So that's one of the most interesting lessons of Genesis that I want us to think about. Let's look at those last two before class is over. Letter B says, Genesis is foundational to understanding the rest of the Bible. Well, that kind of goes without saying now that we've already talked about everything we've talked about. But here I'm talking about the universal history of the world. Genesis is in the top 3 most referenced books in all the New Testament. Psalms is the first, I think, Isaiah, and then Genesis. So Genesis is quoted over and over and over in the New Testament as authoritative and as historical. And that's important. Jesus himself would say, if you don't believe what Moses wrote, there's no way that you're going to be able to assimilate my sayings into your theology, because your theology is going to be off. But if you believe what Moses wrote, then you will be able to understand who I am according to the Scriptures. And of course, he's the second Adam. He's the lawgiver. He's all of those things. And so Genesis is foundational to that. It's a biblical worldview. We talk about the creation. We talk about the fall into sin. We talk about the flood of Noah's day, the Tower of Babel, the dissemination of the nations. Those are all important aspects of a biblical worldview. If you, buy into evolutionary theory or these non-theist or non-biblical worldviews, you're already going to be starting from a deficit, because you're going to get confused. But God tells us what we're supposed to believe about the beginning of everything, because that makes one story, and it's the story God tells us, and it's true. In fact, the last 3 chapters of Revelation put closure on all the themes started in Genesis. The flood of fire that Peter talks about that destroys the heavens and the earth which now exist, and the Garden of Eden in Revelation 22, that's all echoing Genesis chapters 1 through 3, Genesis chapters 1 through 11. All the nations now come and serve in the New Jerusalem. Well, all the nations were in Genesis 10 and 11. So it's amazing. It's amazing. And then finally, I have conversion to Christ is pictured as a new creation. Well, why use that language? Well, because it's based upon the first creation. So the one who created the world now recreates us, creates us anew. And so 2 Corinthians 5:17 is the verse in the New Testament, if any man be in Christ, he is a new creation. Jesus is also the second Adam. So Adam is used in Paul's writings to show why Christ was necessary and why Christ came. At baptism, we have a new birth, John 3:3-5. Let's look at Ephesians 4. We have a couple of minutes. Look at Ephesians 4, because you'll see the allusion to Genesis 1-3 in Paul's statement in Ephesians chapter 4. Verse 20 and following says, "You have not so learned Christ," that is, not with uncleanness, greediness, lewdness of the verse before. Verse 21, "If indeed you have heard him and have been taught by him, as the truth is in Jesus, that you put off concerning your former conduct the old man, which grows corrupt according to the deceitful lust, and be renewed in the spirit of your mind, and that you put on the new man." Well, what's the new man? It's created according to God in true righteousness and holiness. Okay? Look at a parallel with me in two pages over in Colossians chapter 3. And you'll see that even more explicit. I probably should have put Colossians 3 on my notes instead of Ephesians 4, because this is more explicit. Verse 8, Colossians 3:8 says, "Now you yourselves are to put off all these," and then he lists anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language. "Do not lie to one another, since you have put off the old man with his deeds, and you have instead put on the new man, who is renewed in knowledge according to" what? "The image of him who created him." That's directly alluding to Genesis 1, isn't it? God created man in his own image. When men are lewd and get angry and have blasphemy and malice, they are not acting as people created in God's image. They're acting more like people that have been sold into the devil's image, right? But they're not acting like godly people, like image of God. Instead, but when you're